Okay, so hello everybody, and welcome to the Tune-In. Today's a very special episode because the first time ever, Wyatt's twin Noah is going to be on, and just make sure to enjoy the episode, and let's get into it.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Tune-In. For those of you who missed the intro, I'm Noah, who's usually back in the booth. But Brodie and Wyatt have given me the chance to do my own episode this time about ranking the Pink Floyd albums, so let's get into it. So number 15 on my list is their album, Albaugh, which I don't have the album on hand, so I'll just put it up right there. Before I start talking about this album, let me just say it is art, so I do have to respect it. And I can kind of see what they were going for on this album, but it just didn't come through. And also, if you like it, that's fine. But in my opinion, this album's not very good. So I'll just do a quick track by track. It starts with a live disc, actually, of some of their earlier stuff. I'm not going to go too deep into it. But there's one song that isn't on any of their other albums that's on this side, which is their song Careful with the Axe, Eugene, which is a really good, atmospheric, almost horror-esque track about some guy who accidentally himself with an axe, which it's really good. So that's like the one song that I would recommend from this album. But the original stuff just kind of falls flat. It starts with the 4-part Sisyphus, which the first part is like orchestral with some timpani, which I think sounds pretty good. Then the second part starts with some pretty piano, and I thought, hey, this album's actually pretty good so far. I don't know what people are talking about. But then the second half of the song comes on, and it's just Richard Wright just kind of smashing the piano with no real rhythm. And it just gets kind of annoying. And then part 3 comes along with more weird piano and sped up backup vocals. Just not very good. And then part 4 starts with some more orchestrals and some string arrangements, which is really good. And then it kind of swells and then goes back down. And it just kind of does that for the rest of the song. It kind of feels jerky to me. And then we had the song Grantchester Meadows, which, in my opinion, is probably one of the better songs on the album. Still not very good, but the acoustic arrangement is pretty good and the lyrics are fine. And then we have several species of small furry animals gathered together in a cave and grooving with a pick. That's actually the title. It's literally just Roger making animal noises for 4 minutes straight, and it is so annoying. Like, I don't even know what they were thinking. But to get on a more positive note, The Narrow Way, which is another 3-part song, comes up next, which starts with some weird electronic stuff, which the first part isn't bad, it just doesn't really go anywhere. And then part 2 starts with some cool guitar riffs, which I like. The song, once again, doesn't really go anywhere, but it's really not that bad. And then part 3 starts with this droning electronic noise, which isn't, once again, it isn't awful, but the track just kind of stays stagnant the whole time. And then we move on to another 3-part song called The Grand Vizier's Garden Party, which starts with part 1 called Entrance, which is literally just a less than a minute flute solo, which, not really very good. And then we get to Entertainment, which is part 2, which starts with some cool timpani rolling, which once again got my hopes up that the song may be good, but it's kind of just a weird percussive jam, which doesn't really go anywhere. And then we have Exit, which is basically the same as Entrance, so I'm not going to talk about that one. And that's the end of the album. This one, it kind of makes sense that it's the bottom of my list because it's widely regarded by fans as Pink Floyd's worst album. But if you really like it, then that's fine. I'm not one to judge. So let's move on. My number 14 is their album, The Final Cut, which, once again, I'll just put up right there. This album was made at a time where the band was basically near the edge of collapse. Friggin' Roger kind of just became almost like a dictator in the band, and it basically forced out their keyboardist, Rick Wright, and David and Nick were just kind of sidelined. So this is basically just a Roger solo album, but I'll still go through the tracks. The first song is called The Post-War Dream, which has some cool synth over what sounds like a news report, which isn't awful, but the song just kind of drones on for a little while, not very good. And then we have a song called Your Possible Past, which is okay. It's still kind of low tempo like the first song, which is a recurring theme throughout the album. Then we have another song called One of the Few, which has some slightly creepy acoustic guitar over it and a clock ticking, which I personally think is one of the better songs on the album. And then we have When the Tigers Broke Free, which was actually featured in the Wall movie, which it wasn't included on the album, but they decided to throw it in the movie for whatever reason. And it starts with some orchestral stuff before going into lyrics about Roger Waters' father, who died in World War II. The song isn't atrocious, it's not very good, but if I had to recommend one song from the album, it'd probably be this. Then we have The Hero's Return, which starts with some cool guitar parts, which I like. And then the lyrics come in, which seem to be about the teacher from The Wall, which we'll get to later. Once again, not awful, just kind of meh. And then we have The Gunner's Dream, which starts with some almost like intercom on a plane style voiceover. It's kind of a good song. There's some cool saxophone and piano on it, but nothing too great. And then we have Paranoid Eyes, which sounds basically like the rest of the album, another droning, low-tempo song, not much to say. Then we have Get Your Filthy Hands Off My Desert, and yes, that's the actual title, which starts with an explosion followed by some really odd, almost like fancy party-style violins, which is really odd, and the track only lasts a minute. Then we have the Fletcher Memorial Home, which is another highlight from the album, which is about a nursing home for world leaders, which is kind of an odd concept, but either way, the instrumentals aren't half bad, they're just kind of boring. On to the next one. And then we have Southampton Dock, which is just a boring acoustic track. And then we have The Final Cut, the title track, which is another slow piano song. It picks up in the middle, and I thought that maybe it'd be good, but then it just drops back to the same boringness. Then we have Not Now, John, which is actually the first up-tempo song on the album, thankfully, which is actually pretty good. The backup vocals are really good on this track, and it kind of sounds like Young Lust from The Wall. And then the final track, Two Suns in the Sunset, which is another acoustic track about nuclear war. It's not awful, but at this point, you kind of just want the album to end, and thankfully it does. So, overall, not as bad as Ummagumma, but still not very good. So the next album is their album, More, which, once again, I'll put up right here. Moving on. This album was actually commissioned for them as the soundtrack to a countercultural movie in the 60s. There we go. Which is actually a pretty cool concept, and I really wanted to like this album, but it just kind of fell flat for me. So I'll run through the tracks. So it starts with the song Cirrus Minor, which starts with some bird sounds before going into some acoustic. The vocals kind of droning to me, but it's not an awful song. Then we have the Nile song, which is probably my favorite, which is this almost like heavy metal style song with Roger screaming and these really cool distorted guitars. And then we have the Crying song, which is another acoustic track, which is kind of boring, not too much to say about it. And then we have Up the Khyber, which is another acoustic track, if you guessed. It's fine, it's not very good, but yeah, not too much to say about that one. And then we have Green is the Color, which is another acoustic song, which is a recurring theme on the album. And then we have Cymbeline, which is another acoustic song and some piano. It's probably the best of the acoustic tracks, but not one of the greats. And then we have Party Sequence, which is literally just a minute-long bongo solo. And then the main theme with some cool ambient percussive stuff in it. Better than the other songs. Then we have, I think it's pronounced Ibiza Bar, however you pronounce it, which starts with more hard rock guitar, which is kind of similar to the Nile song, but a lesser version of that. Then we have Quicksilver. Oh wait, no. We actually have more blues, which is just kind of like a bluesy guitar solo. It's fine, but it's nothing really good. And then we have Quicksilver, which starts with some clanging metal noises before coming into some vibraphones and synths. Once again, it's fine, still kind of boring. Then we have a Spanish piece, which is some Spanish guy talking over some acoustic guitar. Very odd. And then finally, the dramatic theme, which is this almost like slow, jazzy guitar solo. I mean, it's fine, but the title's kind of deceiving because there's not much dramatic about it. Overall, I feel I really wanted to like this album, but it almost felt like drive-by music, where here's a song, it ends, then here's another song, it ends, and I was hoping for a little more substance. So the next album is their first album called The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, which, once again, I'll put the album cover right here. This album is definitely a step in the right direction. In fact, it's their first album, so it's their first step in the right direction with some of their, I have to say hits. It has one of their hits, but nothing much else. The other songs are good, but this didn't get much airplay. So I'll go over the tracks. We first have the song Astronomy Domine, which is this really cool space rock song. The guitar's really cool. The vocals are also really cool, which are actually done by Syd Barrett, who you may not have heard of. He was Pink Floyd's first frontman, but ended up getting kicked out due to his mental illness and drug use. And his vocal performance on this song is just really good. He has this cool vocal motif that he does a couple times. He goes, ah, which I think is pretty cool. Then we have Lucifer Sam, which is this almost dark, psychedelic blues song with some cool distorted guitar. I think it's one of the best songs on the album. And then we have a song called Matilda Mother, which I feel like it's like the first dud on the album. It's fine, but nothing too special about it. And then we have Flaming, which is another cool psychedelic rock song. It kind of sounds like Pink Floyd's doing a strange combination of The Doors and the Beatles, which is pretty cool to me. And then we have, I think it's pronounced Power Talk, but I'll have Brodie put the pronunciation right here. No, not the pronunciation, the title. This song's okay. It's kind of a weird psychedelic jam, which is fine, but not too much to talk about. Then we have Take Up Thy Stethoscope and Walk, which I personally think is the first actually bad song on the album. It just doesn't really do it for me. Like, the other songs I could listen to if I wanted to, but this song is just not very good. Then we have another one of their hits, Interstellar Overdrive, which is another space rock song, but this one's actually an instrumental, which I think is cool. It almost has like these cool synths and some cool guitar work. Then we have The Gnome, which is a song about a gnome named Grimble Crumble. I'm not making that up. It's kind of weird. And then we have a song called Chapter 24, which is based off some Chinese book, which I feel like it kind of gets the album back on track with some cool psychedelic guitars. Then we have The Scarecrow, which is a short acoustic number, which isn't that bad. I feel like they could have added a little more to it. And then the last song on the album is called The Bike, which it's an odd little tune, but I feel like it has a kind of a charm to it. It's catchy. It has some nice Beatles-esque instrumentals. So, not one of their best albums, but it gets a pass from me. Alright, so next down my list is their album Atom Heart Mother, which, once again, I'm going to put it on this side this time. Alright, so it starts with the title track, which is their first song that's over 20 minutes, which I think is a really cool song. Fun fact, the director of the movie A Clockwork Orange actually wanted to use the song in the movie, but the band didn't let them. Which, I feel like it would have been weird, but that's beside the point. I think this is probably my favorite song on the album. It has some cool synths, some cool orchestral stuff, a nice background chorus. It also has some really cool guitars, which I like, and a couple times it repeats the main theme from the intro, which I think is cool. By the way, the song was also used to be called Theme for an Imaginary Western, which is a mountain song. And you kind of get that feel from the intro. It has some like gunshot sound effects and some horse noises, which I think is kind of cool. I wrote a lot about that song. Then we have the song If, which is this slow, peaceful acoustic song. It's probably my second favorite on the album. I think it has some really meaningful lyrics, which I really like. So I'd probably listen to this one again. Then we have the song Summer 68, which has some nice piano before jumping into a fast swing with some acoustic guitar in it, which I also think is pretty cool. It's not as good as If or the title track, but I still think it's pretty good. Then we have the song Fat Old Sun, which has some Fat Old Sun with a U, not an O. Either way. Then it starts with some bells and then some acoustic guitar. It also ends with a cool guitar solo, which I like. This one's fine. I don't know if I'd listen to it again, but either way. And then the album ends with the song Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast, which is some cool jamming over the sound of a guy making breakfast. But I actually like this song. I think it's experimental, but I also feel like it's inventive. It has the sound of like sizzling bacon, some guy pouring Rice Krispies. So I think it's pretty good. So overall, definitely a good album. Okay, so that's where we'll pause today. Alright, so welcome back everyone, and let's get right into the next album. Alright, so the next album on my list is Obscured by Clouds, which, once again, if you know the drill, I'll put it right here. I feel like this album is where they kind of started to come into their own. It's also another soundtrack album, which is a lot better than their other one, which was more. This was made for like some French 70s film, and so I'll just run through the tracks. So the album starts with the title track, which is a cool synthy instrumental, which is a pretty good track opener. And then we have When You're In, which has some cool rhythm guitar, a cool catchy melody, which I like. Then we have probably my favorite track on the album, Burning Bridges, which is this cool psychedelic rock track with some really nice lyrics, which I really like this track. I think it's cool. I also feel like it was when they were starting to move towards what you'd hear on some of their later albums. Then we have The Gold is in the, which is it almost sounds like classic rock, like something you'd hear from the Eagles or like early Fleetwood Mac. It's a pretty good song. I'd say it's probably like my third or fourth favorite on the album. And then we have What's the Deal, which is the first acoustic track on the album, which it's fine. I still think it's pretty good, but I don't think it's one of the better songs on the album. And then we have Mudmen, which is another instrumental, which kind of sounds like Burning Bridges. It's pretty good. It has that same psychedelic feel about it. And then we have Childhood's End. There we go. With some cool ambient synth and some really poignant lyrics about childhood, which I really like. And then we have Free 4, which is another acoustic track. Which actually, fun fact, Roger Waters used the opening lyrics of this song for his Dark Side of the Moon remake on one of the songs, which I'm not going to get into that whole thing. If you want to look at it, you can research it yourself. But the lyrics are, the memories of a man in his old age are the deeds of a man in his prime. You shuffle in the gloom of the sick room and talk to yourself as you die, which I think are really cool lyrics. And then it kind of, I don't know, I think it's a really cool song. And then Stay, which starts with some slow piano that continues throughout the track, which I think is really cool. The lyrics are nice. There's some more cool guitar work. And finally, the album ends with Absolutely Curtains. Got that one wrong for a second. Which is another cool guitar-driven track to close out the album. So I'd say it was a pretty good album. It kind of felt like they were, I know I said this a lot about this album, but it kind of started to push towards some of their hits. And overall, pretty good album. Alright, so the next album on my list is their album Metal, which, once again, album cover right here. This is probably like one of their most underrated albums. It has it has two, in my opinion, of their best tracks. So the album's only like 5 or 6 tracks long. Put it up here if I'm right. So I'll just run through them. It starts with a really cool track called One of These Days, which starts with a really nice bass riff by Roger before going into some drum fills and then a cool hard rock jam. There's only one lyric, which I don't know if I'm going to be allowed to say on the show. You can look it up if you want, but it might be too violent. So, but still a really good track with some really solid jamming by the band. And then we have Pillow of Winds, which is a really nice acoustic track. Not too much to say about this one, but I still like it. And then we have Fearless, which starts with some cool bluesy guitar before moving into the lyrics of the song. It also ends with the sound of, I think it was a soccer stadium, chanting the lyrics of You'll Never Walk Alone by Roger and Hammerstein, which I think was a cool addition to the song. And then we have Saint-Tropez, which is spelled Saint-Tropez, but this song's fine. Once again, kind of like Mudmen off the last album, it's not one of the better tracks, but it has some cool guitar, it's kind of jazzy, so overall pretty good track. And then we have Seamus, which is, I'm pretty sure is regarded by Pink Floyd fans as one of their worst tracks. Kind of this almost like hillbilly song with some dog barking in the background. I wouldn't say it's worse than anything off of like my bottom 3, but it's still not very good. And then finally, at the very end of the album, we have the best song on the album, the 20-minute opus Echoes, which is this really cool, almost like Voyage Under the Sea, which is really cool. It has some nice guitar and organ melodies. The middle has this cool soundscape section, which I think is really cool. I think David Gilmour uses a guitar to emulate like whale calls, which is also cool. It also has like this cool radar sound at the beginning, which is also cool. And the lyrics, which both have to do with the ocean and also the experience of being human, which are such good lyrics. And I really recommend this song. Even if you don't listen to the rest of the album, any Pink Floyd fan worth their salt should listen to this song. So overall, a pretty good album. Echoes is far and away the best track, but the other ones like One of These Days or Fearless are pretty good as well. Alright, so my next album on my list is A Saucer Full of Secrets, which, once again, I'll put the album cover right here. I feel like this is probably the best of their early works, which I feel like they, unlike Piper at the Gates of Dawn, they really tap in to the psychedelic sound of the 60s, which I think is really cool. So I'll just run through the tracks. So it starts with the song Let There Be More Light, which starts with this weird cultish chant before coming in with some intense instrumentals, which I think is a pretty good song. And then we have Remember a Day, which is an acoustic and piano-driven song about, I think it's about childhood, but I could be wrong. This song's also pretty good. I don't think it's one of the better ones on the album, but I still think it's a pretty good song. And then we have one of their better-known songs from this period, Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, which is another space rock song, which has some cool synthy instrumentals and some pretty good lyrics, which I think is probably the second best song on the album. And then we have Corporal Clegg, which is kind of an odd song. It sounds like the band's trying to imitate the Beatles, which is a little weird. But it also has a kazoo solo. Not going to say anything else about that, so let's just move on to the next track, which ironically is my favorite track on the album, which is the title track, A Saucer Full of Secrets. Now, this is this really cool 4 or 5 part instrumental song. It almost sounds like an orchestral suite, which I think is really cool. I think 2 interpretations I saw of it were either A, a battle and the aftermath of it, or B, as Brodie and Wyatt described it, exploring the universe within your minds. I'll just leave it at that. But still a really cool song. I feel like the end's probably my favorite part with like this choir and these cool orchestral parts. This is probably my #1 track off the album, and it'd be the one I'd recommend to people just listening for like their psychedelic stuff, which I think is cool. But the album continues after that with Seesaw, which is another piano-driven track. It's okay, but I feel like Remember a Day was probably better than it. And then Jug Band Blues, which is this cool acoustic shanty number, which I think is a pretty good way to end the album. So overall, definitely a good album from their psychedelic period. So my next album on my list is The Endless River, which I'll just put that there and move on. I kind of consider this a posthumous album because it was an album made after their keyboardist Richard Wright passed away, and David Gilmour almost like him and Nick Mason like cobbled together some of the old takes that they used from The Division Bell, which is another album I'll get to, and released it. But I think it actually works pretty well. I feel like it has some, I don't know, it just feels like a really meaningful album to me. So since it's a pretty long album, I'll just jump around. The first song, Things Remain Unsaid, which is a cool ambient piano song with some quotes from the band, which I feel like this one song almost like describes their career. Not really encapsulates it, but it's definitely like, it definitely kind of shows what they're all about. Another cool track is called The Lost Art of Conversation, which is a pretty cool song, which has some cool piano and guitar parts. There's Nightlight, which is this almost lullaby-ish song, which I think is really pretty. And then there's also Talkin' Hawkin', which I'll put the pronunciation right here. No, not the pronunciation. I did this last time. The name of the song, I'll put it right here, which is a cool, flowy synth song. It also has some quotes from Stephen Hawking, which I think adds a lot to it. And there's also a song Calling, which has some cool instrumental electronic parts. And finally, probably my favorite song on the album, and the only song with words, called Louder Than Words, which I think is a really beautiful song. The lyrics are just amazing, and I feel like it's a really good way for Pink Floyd to end their career. But overall, a really good album. It may feel like easy listening music to some people, but I think it's a really good album. Alright, so the next album on my list is A Momentary Lapse of Reason, which I feel like this and Endless River are 2 of their more underrated album covers. But I'm not here to talk about the album covers, I'm here to talk about the album. So this is more of like, since this was in the 80s, they kind of were diving into more synth stuff, which I think actually benefits the band, because it doesn't sound like they're reaching for the same, doing the same thing as Wish You Were Here or Dark Side of the Moon, which I think is commendable. So the album starts with, I'm pretty sure it's an instrumental, but I could be wrong, called Signs of Life, which has some cool nature sounds and more cool synth. This very well may be a lyrical song, but I'll have Brodie put it up here if I'm wrong. And then we have the single off the album, Learning to Fly, which was about David Gilmour and Richard Wright's experience being pilots. And this is a really good, almost heavy song. It has some cool drums, some really cool crunchy guitar parts, which I like. And then we have my favorite song on the album, The Dogs of War, which is this cool synth-driven song about it's about generals, but it almost kind of sounds like it's about mercenaries or hitmen, which I think is a really cool concept, and I feel like it's really well executed. The lyrics are almost sinister sounding, but it works because of the music also being dark. And then we have One Slip, which is, I'm not going to say what it's about, You can look it up if you want to, but it may not be appropriate for the show. Which, it's an okay song. It isn't amazing. It's probably my least favorite off this album, but it still has some good synth stuff in it and more cool instrumentals. And then we have probably my second favorite song on the album called On the Turning Away, which is this really beautiful call to action to help people in need, which it has some really beautiful piano parts, and the lyrics are really poignant, which I know Dogs of War is probably my favorite, but if I had to recommend people one song of this album, it would be this one. And then we have Yet Another Movie, which is, I feel like it's like one of the longer songs on the album, but I still think it's pretty good. I still think it's a really cool synth-driven track. And then we have Round It Around. This one's kind of forgettable, but I still think it's pretty good. And then we have I'll Just Lump A New Machine Part 1 and 2 together, even though they're separate on the album. This is a really cool, almost like, I don't even know how to describe it. It gives me the feeling of like some almost like electronic, robotic overlord to me, which the lyrics are kind of ambiguous, but they're so good. People may find them too short and just feel like random interludes, but I think they're really cool. And then we have the instrumental Terminal Frost, which is another synth-driven song, which people may start to get tired of, but I still think it works. And then we have the final track, Sorrow, which is one of the better songs off the album with some cool guitar and synth. So overall, definitely a good album and a good way to introduce Pink Floyd into the 80s. So the next album on my list is their album Animals, which once again I'll put right here. This is a really cool album and also a really cool concept for an album, which was inspired by George Orwell's Animal Farm, which in this album the people are basically put into casts of sheep, pig, and dog. The sheep are the followers, the dogs are the enforcers, and the pigs are like the rulers and the government, which I think is a really cool concept, and I think they put it really well into the album. So I'll just run through the tracks. So it starts off with the acoustic Pigs on a Wing, which I think is a really cool, I think it's like the first love song that Pink Floyd ever written, which I think Roger wrote about his wife, which I don't think it's my favorite off the album, but I still think it's pretty good. And then we have, I think Sheep is up next, which all the songs on this album are like 10 minutes or over, which I think it was a bold move by the band, but I think it pays off. Now, back to Sheep, which is this really cool song about like the peasants rising up and overthrowing the dogs, which is a really cool concept, and it has some really good, I think it has some acoustic guitar work as being in a song, which I think is cool. And then we have, I'm pretty sure Dogs is up next, which is probably my favorite song on the album due to its crunchy guitar and really cool concept of one of the dogs is past, basically catching up to them in their old age, which is a really cool concept for a song, and I think the biting instrumentals and vocals really help it. And then we had the song called Pigs, 3 different ones, which Roger wrote about. There was 3 different politicians he wrote about. The only one I remember was Margaret Thatcher, which he didn't like. And I think it's a really good song. It has some really almost insulting lyrics, but I think it works for the subject matter. And it also has some really good instrumentals. And finally, the album closed out with Pigs on a Wing Part 2, which is relatively similar to the first one, so I won't go too far into it. So overall, a really good concept album. I think you can call it a concept album, but either way, just one of their better albums. So my next album is The Division Bell, which is it's one of my favorite Pink Floyd albums, because I feel like it hits me on a more emotional level than some of the other ones, which I just feel like it's really underrated by their fan base. So if there's any Pink Floyd fans watching who haven't heard this album, you should really check it out. So I'll just run through the tracks. It starts out with the instrumental Cluster 1, which is this cool synth-driven instrumental song that also has some cool guitar in it. And then we have the friggin' biting, almost cruel-sounding What Do You Want From Me, which the band denied any of these songs being about Roger, who they broke up with before. It was after the final cut they broke up with him. But this song almost sounds like a almost sounds like an insult towards him for overworking the band, which I think it's a really cool, really gritty instrumental. No, not instrumental. The instrumentals are really gritty. There we go. And then we have the song Pulls Apart, which is another really cool song. Not much to say about it, but it's just really cool. And then we have the song Marooned, which is probably my favorite song on the album, even though it's an instrumental, which it almost has the same feeling as Echoes, where it's kind of the theme of like being stuck on an island, and probably, in my opinion, having one of David Gilmour's best solos. It's just such a good song. It has a really cool concept to it, and the instrumentals really suit that almost, I hate to say Hawaiian, but tropical island feel, which it's just such a good song. You should really go listen to it. And then we have A Great Day for Freedom, which is about the destruction of the Berlin Wall, which I think that's such a good idea for a song, and the instrumentals really suit it with the nice vocals and the really cool guitar parts and keyboards. And then we had the song Wearing the Inside Out, which this one is probably my least favorite on the album, mainly because I don't remember much about it, but I still think it's a really cool song. And then we have the song Take It Back, which is actually an environmental song, but I still think it works. It has some cool synth parts, the lyrics are really good, and it's almost like a call to action to undo the damage that humanity's done to the earth. And then we have the song, which is my second favorite on the album, Coming Back to Life, which is a really beautiful song. It's almost uplifting and like a call to keep going and don't give up, which I think is a really beautiful song. And I think the instrumentals, like the cool synth and some cool piano on it, it also has some really good guitar work on it, which there's only like one solo in it, but I still think it's really good. And then we have Keep Talking, which is, I also think that this is a really good song. It has some cool backup. David almost does like a call and response thing with the backup singers, which I think is really neat. Then we have the song Lost for Words, which is an instrumental song. And it's also really good. This is another one that I really don't remember much about, but it has some cool synth and guitar work, which I think is really good. And then we have the song High Hopes, which is almost like the climax of the album. It's basically almost about David's childhood, which may sound like a mundane concept, but I feel like they really make it epic with the swelling orchestrals and this really cool lap steel solo that David does. So, and it's also 8 minutes, so they have enough time to like let the song breathe, which I think is really cool. So overall, another really good album. So my number 3 album on my list is their album, The Wall, which there's so much I could say about it. I could talk for hours about this one album, which it's just such a good album. In my opinion, the greatest concept album ever made, which it's just such a good album. So I'll run through a couple of the tracks since it's a pretty long album. It starts with the song In the Flesh, which introduces us to our main character, Pink, who this album's basically like his descent into madness, which I think that's a really cool concept for a story for a concept album, which I think is cool. It has some really biting organ and cool guitar. Then there's also the song Goodbye Blue Sky, which is this really pretty acoustic song about the aftermath of World War II, which it's such a beautiful song. The lyrics and the instrumentals almost like bounce off each other, but I think it works really well. And then there's also a song which was a single from the album, Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, which is basically everyone's heard it at this point. It's the cool disco-inspired anti-school number, which I think it was a pretty good choice to be the number 1 single from this album. It has a cool funk groove to it and also a pretty cool guitar solo. There's also the song Hey You, which starts the second side of the album, which it starts acoustic, but then goes into this really driving, crunchy guitar solo, which I think is really beautiful. And then there's my personal favorite Pink Floyd song, Comfortably Numb, which I could talk for hours about this one song. It is so good. The lyrics are really good. And the two guitar solos are probably two of the best in rock history. The chorus is so good. It's almost like angelic in the orchestrals and David's vocals, which it's just such a good song, and I highly recommend going to listen to it. And then there's the second to last song, The Trial, which is this almost like soundtrack song, which I don't think it really has too much like rock influence, but it's almost influenced by like Disney music. And it's basically Pink putting himself on trial for all the bad things he's done to people, which it's just such a good song, and it's a good way to be almost a climax to the album. There are a ton more songs that I haven't talked about for the sake of time, but you should really go listen to this album. It is so good, and I cannot recommend it enough. So my number 2 album on my list is Dark Side of the Moon. What more can I say about this album that hasn't been said? It's probably one of the top 2 greatest albums in rock history. There's so much that I could say that's already been said before, which I probably will say. So I'll just run through the tracks. It starts with the instrumental Speak to Me, which it almost introduces all the motifs that you'll see on the album before jumping into the song Breathe, which is this cool, almost like spacey song, which I think is really cool. And then it jumps into the song On the Run, which is this cool synth-driven song that it almost like encapsulates like the fear of traveling and or flying, which I think is cool, before jumping into the classic song Time, which this is probably my second favorite song on the album. It's just such a good, like, it has some really good lyrics. The guitar work is on point as always. And then it jumps into my favorite song on the album, Great Gig in the Sky, which there's not even really much of the band on this song. It's Richard Wright and his keyboard and a guest vocalist, Claire Torrey, and her vocal performance is just so good. This song is almost about death, which I think the vocal improv and the cool, almost haunting piano melody really suits that. The only other instrumental part of the song is this cool slide guitar that David does, which I think is really good. And then we have the song that opens up the second side called Money, which has a really cool funky bass groove and some really cool lyrics about capitalism. It also has another one of David Gilmour's best guitar solos, but you could basically say that about any song on the album. And that goes into another great track, Us and Them, which is one of the slower tracks on the album, but I think it works really well. David does some cool guitar arpeggios, and there's also some cool synth underneath it. And the chorus is just so good. It has almost a swelling organ, and the song's about, I think I already said the song's about war, but either way, it's just such a good song. Before jumping into the third instrumental on the album, Any Color You Like, which is this really cool, like, synthy guitar jam, which some people may say it's not a very good song, but I think it's really good. And then we have the song Brain Damage, which is another all-time classic, with some cool lyrics about insanity that kind of tie back to Syd Barrett, and some almost like crazed laughter in it, which I think adds to it. Then that transitions directly into the final song on the album, Eclipse, which basically summarizes every point made on the album about life. And it ends with the same heartbeat that started Speak to Me, which I think is really good. And just such a good album. Basically, if you like rock music, you need to listen to this album at some point. The final album on my list, and my personal favorite Pink Floyd album, Wish You Were Here. This album is so beautiful and poignant, and so many other words I could say to describe it. It's just such a clever album. I think it's just really good. It starts off with Shine On You Crazy Diamond, part 1 through 5, which is almost like a tribute. This whole album is basically a tribute to Syd Barrett, who kind of gone insane at this point. So they're almost mourning him. And this is probably my favorite song on the album. Has some really haunting synths, a really nice guitar solo from David, and just the lyrics of it are so beautiful. In fact, I think I'm going to pull some of them up real quick. Some of these lyrics are just so good, like, when you were young, you shone like the sun. There's also, you were caught in the crossfire of childhood and stardom. Come on, you stranger, you legend, you martyr, which is another beautiful lyric. This whole song is just so good, and I cannot recommend it enough. Then we have the haunting, almost evil song, Welcome to the Machine, which is this almost dark, synth-driven song about the music industry basically being a monster, almost like eating away at the artist's creativity, which I think is really cool. And then we have another song about the music industry, Have a Cigar, which is, this song's more, if the first one was more monstrous, this one's more like greedy record executives, has a really funky guitar riff, which I think is really nice, and some almost like sarcastic lyrics. Fun fact, this song actually wasn't sung by Roger or David, but a really kicking song, whatever that means. And then we have the only acoustic song in the album, Wish You Were Here, which is this really beautiful song. It has such good lyrics. It feels like the lyrics almost have like a contrast in every verse. Like, one of the lyrics is, did they get you to trade your heroes for ghosts? Which, if I could get a poster of that lyric, I probably would. But the lyrics are just so beautiful, and it's just such a great song. And then we finally end with Shine On You Crazy Diamonds, part 6 through 9, I think, which is another really good song. I could basically say everything I said about the first parts about this one, but it's just such a beautiful album. There's so much heart put into it. It just, go listen to it, which is so good. Okay, so that's the end of my list. I'll see you whenever I see you. This is the Tune In, tuning out. Bye.